So two concept needs, two are key in the functioning of the Wall Street consensus. One is the notion that you mentioned quickly, but I'd like you to come back to it, which is the notion of de-risking, which is not only at the center of your work, but at the center of what your work describes. And also this other really important thing, which is the production of investable project, right? So we already understand from what you described where they fit in this Wall Street consensus, but when do they appear as concept, first of all? Because if you think, for instance, of the Eurozone crisis of 2011, 2012, there you still have this notion that, austerity has to be justified in kind of an old neoliberal way. So it's not about so much the return of the state. So even though probably the Wall Street consensus de facto, well, first of all, that's my question. When do you think it actually starts without being recognized as such? And when does it start being fully recognized as such, with then the concept of de-risking and the concepts of investable projects being used?
Very good. I would say that investibility has been a kind of neoliberal, in a sense, an obsession and a priority and a problem of the neoliberal state since the collapse of the Bretton Woods system and the ideological victory of monetarism. So I would say, if I was to kind of historicize the Wall Street consensus, there are pillars or dynamics of the consensus that start as early as the 1980s, and I like to think of them as a kind of, there is let's call it a social bargain with financiers that starts in the 1980s, and the macro bargain with financiers that also starts in the 1980s. And that second bargain is a bargain around or a pact around investibility of government bonds. So in a sense, it is kind of investibility. It starts as a state project in some ways, as a project of making government bonds investable, and then it gets extended to other areas of economic life later, after the global financial crisis. And let me try to elaborate a bit. What do I mean by this investibility pact? And here, in many ways, if you can read monetarism in many different ways, right? Milton Friedman, so for example, when Milton Friedman explains inflation, right, which was the big economic question to resolve in the late 1970s. He gives a speech in 1978, and he says, it is customary for us to blame the oil sheikhs or the trade unions or corporations for inflation. But oil sheikhs don't produce inflation, corporations don't produce inflation, trade unions don't produce inflation. What produces inflation is Washington. Inflation is produced in Washington by the government, who gets access to the printing press and creates money. And this money, this excessive money creation, it basically generates inflation. So this is an account to me of inflation as a political problem and as a money creation problem that requires institutionally a divorce between monetary and fiscal policy. Right? It's a if you can think about it, there was a Keynesian marriage between the two, in which the central bank, and this goes even before Keynesianism, the central bank was a fiscal agent of the state, and it had overt or implicit responsibilities for preserving or defending borrowing costs or keeping borrowing costs low for the state throughout. It always does throughout wars. Throughout the Keynesian period, there was a kind of fiscal subordination, as in monetary policy was subordinated to fiscal policy priorities. And Milton Friedman says we need this divorce to happen if we are to control inflation. We need, and Margaret Thatcher was famously photographed with her hand on the printing press saying, that's it, that's the end. We will no longer, populist governments will no longer print money in order to satisfy, certain sectional political interests. From now on, you will have technocratic central banks basically in control of inflation by making sure that they impose a certain money growth rule. And then a lot of debate around monetarism focused on, was it the right money supply definition? Was it the right policy? Is it interest rates or quantities of money that matter? And to me, a critical macrofinance account says, forget about that. I mean, that's important. The way in which you design the monetary policy framework is important. But if we want to tell a story about a broader kind of consensus emerging out of neoliberalism, out of the Washington consensus and morphing into the Wall Street consensus, you have to think about the ways in which this divorce between monetary and fiscal policy creates problems for both the monetary authority and for the fiscal authority. And that problem essentially is, what do you do when the central bank no longer wants to have responsibility either as your fiscal agent, so you as a treasury don't have an account at the central bank, or when the central bank doesn't want to use government bonds to implement monetary policy. It wants to stay away from the government bond market as much as possible. And in those two scenarios, and I mean, there are some technicalities of the differences between those two scenarios, but in those two scenarios, the end result is that the government has to think, who's going to buy my bonds? If I issue bonds, either because I need to reduce the amount of central bank money in existence, or because I am banking with a commercial bank, and in order to spend, I need to get money added into that commercial bank. Once governments have to face this problem, the question of investibility becomes fundamental, because you have to then now compete with other governments to attract investors. And how do you generate liquidity for your government bond market becomes very important. And here where the pact with financiers matters, because in the 1980s and 1990s, we see governments everywhere giving the financiers in what we call the repo market, in the market where you can finance government bonds by using them as collateral. It gives financiers free rein to design a set of rules and a set of practices that would create additional liquidity in that market. And even after, when the problems with that market become apparent after 1998, after the collapse of long-term capital management, the LTCM, the hedge fund was taking leverage positions on government bonds, both central banks and fiscal authorities or ministries of finance recognize that there is a problem in this liquidity pact with financiers, because the more you allow leverage-hungry or profit-hungry financial institutions like hedge funds, the more you allow them to use government bonds as collateral in order to increase the amount of leverage they can get in the system, the more vulnerability and financial instability you inject in the financial system. So there is a recognition that there is a systemic vulnerability there, but for governments, the investibility priority remains the key one, and they take measures in order to make it easier for financiers to use government bonds as collateral. Paul Volcker very famously in 1984, I think, changes the legal provisions around collateral in repo markets to make sure that if you lend again in a repo transaction against government bonds, and the borrower, the financial institution to which you lend, becomes insolvent, you can keep that collateral and liquidate it, which you could do in the European Union, the European countries at the time, because the legal provisions were different, but in the US you couldn't. So we see governments taking increasingly these are technical legal steps to make government bonds more investable by basically saying to financiers, please use them for leverage, please use them for speculation. We hoped that because we are a safe asset, because in crisis you have to run to government bonds, nothing will go wrong. So this, and you can see the story. I told you some details about it in the United States. You can see the same story in countries as diverse as Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, where there are various levels of suspicion around the instability properties of this liquidity pact. But because this global competition for bond investors becomes fiercer and fiercer, basically governments everywhere kind of give into it. So investibility has been there for a very long time. Central banks also contributed to it. It wasn't only governments. They had a kind of separate pact with repo financiers. Salomon Brothers is a very good example of a repo financier that was basically cuddled by both the central bank, by the Federal Reserve, and the U.S. Treasury after it cornered, or it kind of speculated with U.S. Treasuries in 1991. In a very blatant speculative attack on U.S. Treasuries, and it got away with a slap on the wrist, and it got the U.S. government to change the rules governing the U.S. Treasury market to make it easier for future speculators in some way to kind of speculate in there. There wasn't a massive, and I think that's a fascinating episode, because there wasn't a massive reorganization of the financial system. It was just incremental changes to make it easier for financiers to use collateral in the way that Salomon Brothers did. So for central banks, the problem was different, and the European Central Bank is a great example, and I'm going to use it because you mentioned the European sovereign debt crisis. And to me, the European sovereign debt crisis is a crisis of investibility that is created, or whose roots are very much this investibility pact that the European Central Bank did with repo financiers in the euro area during the 1990s and early 2000s. And the problem there for the ECB, like other central banks, is that they didn't want to use government bonds a lot to buy and sell. This is how you used to do interest rate policy. You would buy outright and you would sell outright government bonds. The problem of buying government bonds outright for a monetarist, independent central bank is that it looks like you're monetizing government debt. So they said, instead of doing that, we will use repos. We will use the same instrument that the governments are using in order to try to generate additional liquidity in their government bond markets and hopefully reduce the interest rates which they pay on their debt. We will use repos because this way, by giving banks loans over 2 weeks through a repo contract, we are not the legal owners of government bonds for more than those 2 weeks. It's a temporary change of ownership, but it's not monetary financing because the economic owner of those government bonds in a repo transaction remains the bank who is using them as collateral. It's a very clever instrument, and financiers are very clever, and you have to understand the technicalities to kind of go to the political economy aspects. And the European Central Bank did its best to try to use its collateral framework to achieve to resolve some of the political problems that a monetary union without a fiscal union had. And I think this is where the critical macrofinance is important analytically, because it asks us to understand, to think about the evolving relationship between the macroeconomic policy institutions and finance as solving particular problems of the state, not just resolve or kind of subordinating the state to the profit imperatives of the financial system. And in this case, the turn to repo markets and the turn to, or the encouragement of more market-based finance in Europe was the ECB's response to the political problem of how do I implement monetary policy for countries as diverse as Greece and Germany. And they said, and the ECB said, well, if everybody in finance treated Greek government bonds and German government bonds as the same collateral, then it's easier for me to do monetary policy. and to encourage them to treat the Greek government bonds and Greek government bonds as equal collateral, as the same country, basically. That was the intuition. They create a kind of synthetic fiscal union because the politics wasn't there for a real one. The ECB treated Greek government bonds and German government bonds as equal collateral in its collateral portfolio. So if you were an Irish bank, you could go to the ECB and say, okay, if I give you Greek bonds or Greek sovereign bonds, or if I give you German government bonds, is the same. I will get the same. The terms of the borrowing would be the same regardless of collateral. And the ECB thought this was a very clever solution. Nobody noticed it because look how long it took me to explain this to you. And in general, there were a couple of Dutch economists who complained about it, and Jean-Claude Trichet in 2005 had to go to the European Parliament and say, well, we are not, because of course the charge against this is like kind of de facto subsidies for the weaker rated sovereigns. And Jean-Claude Trichet said, well, we are not subsidizing Greece, we are not giving special favors to Greece and other lower rated sovereigns, because we use in our framework, we have adopted the practices of investibility that private finance has. We mark this collateral to market and we make margin calls. And this turned out to be very, very damaging during the European sovereign debt crisis, because the ECB's collateral framework was basically amplifying what we call procyclical pressures. It was amplifying a liquidity run or a run on Greek collateral when it had to do the opposite, right? And we see there the consequences of an investibility pact. And we also see with that, once you enter an investibility pact with financiers, in which your ability to meet political commitments to your voters relies to a certain extent on that investibility pact holding throughout good times and bad times, right? Because if it doesn't hold throughout bad times and you see your government bond borrowing costs increasing, you're going to completely, any kind of political project will very quickly collapse under these conditions. And you can think about today is the 11th of April. Yes, 2 days ago we saw how easily bond markets intimidate politicians. They intimidated the Trump administration, and we didn't some didn't expect. I thought it's kind of easy to intimidate it with that. And what we saw in 2011, 2012 is the investibility pact reaching its logical conclusion, which is the deeper the entanglement between the state and private finance in the government bond market, the more the more it requires the state to accommodate and to support investibility throughout good and bad times. And that's where the term de-risking and the practice of de-risking became normalized even before 2015. It became normalized in government bond markets when central banks said, okay, I'm just going to go and buy government bonds during bad times when nobody wants to buy them. I will buy them and preserve their investibility. So this is how critical macrofinance thinks very differently about quantitative easing. It thinks very, very differently about the purchase of government bonds by central banks during periods of market tension in 2008, 2009, then during the COVID pandemic. These are not interventions designed to support governments. These are interventions designed to uphold the investibility pact that historically was developed as a response to or as a solution to the specific institutional problems that the neoliberal divorce between monetary and fiscal policy created. And incidentally, it was very fascinating to me 2 days ago when Trump explained why he had decided to basically pause the very substantive tariffs on all countries except China. He said, oh, well, I saw that people were a bit nervous and the bond market was not doing very well. And I thought, okay, I will have to try to find a different kind of solution. He never brought the Federal Reserve in the picture, which I'm expecting it will happen at some point quite soon.